This video is for educational purposes only.
Cold metal pliers. And if you listen to the tape, you'll hear those pliers being replaced in the toolbox a few seconds later. Oh!
What happens when two criminals convicted for the same type of crime form a friendship within the confines of a prison cell? In the case of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, it led to a reign of terror that would forever haunt sunny Los Angeles in the late 1970s. United by their deviant desires and sinister fantasies, they unleashed a chain of crimes so horrifying it earned them the nickname, the Toolbox Killers. This is the chilling tale of how a bond forged in the darkest corners of a jail cell led to a series of brutal kills. In the late 1970s, Los Angeles was a melting pot of high hopes and bitter disappointments. There were as many dreams as palm trees, and people came from all over the country with big dreams to be a part of Hollywood and the music business. It was a world with a beautiful shine, a city that was alive, and a place where dreams could come true. But underneath all the glitz and glitter, a hidden darkness ran through the city, an evil that cruised in a sinister van. Their names, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, soon to be known as the Toolbox Killers. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born on September 27, 1940, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He never knew his biological parents. His mother was a would-be mother who left him in an orphanage after his birth. By the time he was adopted, his adoptive father, George Bittaker, had already built a criminal record and often involved his adoptive son in petty crimes. The Bittaker family moved around frequently, which left Lawrence with a disjointed, unstable upbringing. Even though Lawrence had a high IQ of 138, he didn't do well in school and often got into trouble, which began to reveal signs of his deviant path. His first brush with the law came at the tender age of 12 when he was arrested for shoplifting. Over the following years, it escalated from petty thefts to hit-and-run accidents, evading arrest, and theft of vehicles. Bittaker would spend the better part of his life, from his teenage years through early adulthood, in and out of correctional institutions. His offenses grew progressively worse, involving harming people and attempts to escape from the state institutions. It was within these prison walls that his path would cross with Roy Norris. Roy Lewis Norris was born on February 5, 1948, in Green Lake, Colorado, but not into a stable or loving family. Instead, he was the product of a broken home. His parents divorced when he was only 4 years old, causing Norris to bounce between different foster homes in his mother's care. This instability would later play an important role in his future behavioral issues. But it wasn't apparent, at least not until his adolescence, when he repeatedly got in trouble at school and had numerous encounters with law enforcement. His criminal behavior escalated until his first arrest at 17 for breaking into a woman's house. Norris joined the U.S. Navy in 1965 and served in the Vietnam War. But it did nothing to reform his character. Instead, things only got worse, and he was convicted of attacking women multiple times, eventually getting him kicked out of the Navy. But things took an even more drastic turn from there. He was convicted for a series of crimes, including attacking women, throughout the 1970s. It was during this time he met Lawrence Bittaker. Lawrence and Roy met at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, California, where they served time for harsh crimes. Bittaker was in prison for attempted homicide, while Norris was serving time for harming women. The fact that they both liked to harm others and had dark, inappropriate fantasies made them bond very fast. They spent a lot of time together in jail, where they found out they both liked fantasizing about harming women, especially teenage girls, and being in charge. They would talk about these thoughts to pass the time and eventually planned to make them a reality once they were released. The plan that Bittaker and Norris concocted while in prison was particularly terrifying. They would drive around in a modified van, which they later referred to as a killer van. The van was a 1977 GMC cargo van, which was windowless on the sides and had a large passenger side sliding door. The modifications were to make the abduction process easier for them. While one of them drove, the other would slide open the door and yank in their unsuspecting victims. Their intended victims were female hitchhikers they believed would be easy targets and less likely to be reported missing immediately. They also wanted to end the life of at least one girl from each age of 13 through 19. Their toolbox was a key part of their plan. It contained items that one might typically find in a household toolbox: hammers, pliers, and screwdrivers. However, They planned to use them to inflict pain on their victims before ending them. Their plan also included audio recordings of their victims' suffering. These recordings did two things. They provided a twisted form of gratification for Bittaker and Norris, and they would later serve as damning evidence against them. After their release from prison, both Bittaker and Norris wasted no time in bringing their disturbing fantasies to life. They started their horrifying spree in June 1979, just months after their release. Their first victim was Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, a 16-year-old girl who had just attended a church meeting on the evening of June 24, 1979. She was walking home when Bittaker and Norris saw her. They offered her a ride, but she initially declined. Undeterred, Bittaker and Norris drove ahead and parked their van to wait for Lucinda. As she walked past them, they approached her again. This time, Norris forced her into a van while Bittaker handled any potential witness by pretending to look for a missing address. Lucinda was taken to a remote location where she was subjected to hours of torment, which was recorded for their twisted pleasure. They used the tools in their toolbox to hurt her, creating an atmosphere of terror that's hard to fully comprehend. Despite her horrific ordeal, she refused to comply with their demand to show fear or beg, maintaining an almost unimaginable level of bravery under the circumstances. Eventually, they ended her life and her body was discarded in a canyon, the first in a series of young victims claimed by the Toolbox Killers. The first one set the tone for their subsequent attacks. The next was Andrea Joy Hall, an 18-year-old who was abducted from a hitchhiking spot along the Pacific Coast Highway. Andrea was thumbing rides when a silver 1977 GMC Vendura pulled up to her. The door slid open, revealing two smiling faces that seemed innocent at first, but little did she know that stepping into that van would be the end of her life. Bittaker and Norris had stumbled onto Andrea at just the right time. No one knew her travel plans that day, and so her sudden disappearance wouldn't ring any immediate alarm bells. The two men recognized the golden opportunity they had to carry out their gruesome fantasies without the immediate scrutiny of the authorities and took advantage of it. Their joy knew no bounds as they used her as their toy, their plaything. As summer turned into early autumn, their hunger only grew. They developed an insatiable lust for the fear and pain they put their victims through, a grotesque addiction that needed to feed. On September 3, 1979, two young girls, Jacqueline Doris Gilliam and Jacqueline Leah Lamp, became the newest victims of this thirst, aged 15 and 13 respectively. The girls had just left their school bus when the silver van rolled up to their stop and carried them away. Perhaps the most infamous crime they committed was the Halloween night abduction and life ending of a 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. This case stood out not only because of the particularly gruesome nature of the torture, but also because Bittaker and Norris recorded the entire thing. Shirley was a spirited teenager with her whole life ahead of her, but as she stepped into the all-too-familiar silver van on that ill-fated night, the brutal torment they subjected Shirley to was merciless and horrifying, even by their standards. Each scream, each plea was met with further savagery, all while their recorder captured everything. As the number of victims went up, the police and masses became really worried. There were a few clues that tied these crimes together. For starters, all the victims were young girls who had disappeared in Los Angeles. They all vanished from busy places, and there was no evidence of a fight at the spots they were last seen, which meant they were probably taken away very quickly and by force. The victims' ages and where they vanished from weren't the only things that were the same. When the bodies of some of the victims were found, they showed the same signs of cruel harm, violation, and injuries made with different tools. This led to these men being called the Toolbox Killers. Because the kidnappings were so bold and the crimes so terrible, they became widely known very quickly. Their acts scared many people in Southern California and were even reported in the news across the country. The hunt for these men was one of the biggest ever in the area and was particularly difficult for the police. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. They knew they were looking for two men, but that was about it. But they never gave up until they finally got a lead which came unexpectedly. It wasn't from finding a key piece of evidence like in some detective movies. No, it came from a chat between two old jail friends. Norris, who couldn't keep his mouth shut, had narrated everything to an old friend he had been with in jail. His old pal was unsurprisingly shocked by what he had heard and knew he couldn't just keep quiet about it. So he went to the cops, who didn't even have a single lead, but now they had a confession and needed proof. So they searched the van of Bittaker and Norris, where they found a very upsetting recording of one of their crimes, which was all the proof they needed. In the weeks and months that followed, the case against Bittaker and Norris began to build. Their arrest turned heads, but it was the trial that truly shocked the nation. Norris made a deal. He would testify against Bittaker in exchange for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. His request was granted, and so he narrated everything. His voice was chillingly calm as he described the horrific details of their crimes, recounting each gruesome act with an unsettling nonchalance that sent shivers down the spines of all present. It was hard for people to believe that someone could do such horrible things and talk about them so easily. But the most shocking part of the trial came when the court played the audio tapes that Bittaker and Norris had recorded. The room fell silent as Shirley Lynette Ledford's cries and pleas filled the air, interrupted only by the laughter and mocking comments of these criminals. The reality of their sadism, so vividly and horrifically displayed, was too much for many in the courtroom, with experienced personnel and hardened reporters breaking down in tears. The trial concluded with Bittaker being sentenced to death. He didn't even show any signs of remorse. In fact, he denied that he had done anything wrong and even claimed that they had paid the girls for intimacy and to take their pictures. Norris, on the other hand, because of his plea deal and testimony against Bittaker, was spared the death penalty. He was, however, sentenced to life imprisonment with a chance of parole after 30 years. Both Bittaker and Norris ended up dying in prison. Bittaker died in 2019, and Norris died in 2020. But even though they were gone, the terrible crimes they committed still haunt many to this day.